I remember the exact moment I saw it. A press release on my phone. Robert's name at the top. New venture. Innovative model. Industry-changing concept. I read the headline once. Then again, because the idea described in that article was mine. 6 months earlier, I had explained it to him over coffee. Not as a formal pitch. Just a conversation between a mentor and someone early in their career. He had listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions. Then he went quiet about it. I assumed he didn't think the idea was worth pursuing. But there it was. My concept. His company. I didn't call him. I didn't send an angry message. Instead, I closed the article, opened my laptop, and started building the same idea myself. When I first met Robert, I was still early in my career. Not brand new to the industry, but still at that stage where you know enough to be ambitious and not quite enough to see all the risks yet. I had energy, ideas, a strong work ethic. What I didn't have yet was experience. And in industries like mine, experience matters. Not just the technical kind, the strategic kind. The kind that tells you which opportunities are real and which ones only look good on paper. That's why people look for mentors. Someone who has already walked the path. Someone who has made the mistakes so you don't have to repeat them. Robert had that reputation. His name came up constantly in industry conversations. Not in a flashy way, but in a respectful one. People described him as thoughtful, strategic, someone who built things carefully and successfully over time. His company had grown steadily for years, and he had a reputation for understanding the market better than most people. So when I met him in an industry event, I was paying attention. The event itself was nothing special. A small conference room, a few panels, the usual networking afterward where people stand around holding coffee cups and trying to sound more confident than they feel. A colleague introduced us. Robert, this is the guy I was telling you about. Robert shook my hand and gave a small smile. He had a calm presence about him, the kind of person who listens more than he talks. He asked me a few questions. Where I was working, what projects I was involved in, what parts of the industry interested me the most. It wasn't an interrogation. It felt more like curiosity. Before the conversation ended, he said something simple. You seem like someone who thinks about the bigger picture. Let's grab coffee sometime. For someone early in their career, an invitation like that means something. Not because you expect immediate opportunity, but because access to experience is valuable. A week later, we met at a cafe near his office. The conversation lasted about an hour. Most of it was Robert talking about the early years of building his company, the risks he took, the things that almost went wrong, the decisions that worked better than expected. What struck me most was how calm he was when he described the difficult parts. He talked about mistakes the same way someone talks about weather. Not emotional, just factual. That decision cost me a year, he said at one point. Then he smiled slightly. But it taught me something useful. Those kinds of stories are valuable when you're still figuring things out, because they make success feel less mysterious. After that first meeting, we started meeting every few weeks. Sometimes coffee, sometimes a quick lunch. The conversations were never formal. He never called it mentorship, but that's what it became. I would tell him about projects I was working on, challenges I was facing, ideas I was considering, and he would respond with questions that forced me to think more carefully. Why would a client choose that model? What problem are you actually solving? Where does the value come from? He had a way of simplifying complex ideas, not by dismissing them, but by breaking them down until the core logic became clear. Over time, trust builds naturally in that kind of relationship, not through dramatic moments, through repetition. Conversation after conversation where someone consistently gives thoughtful advice. He even introduced me to a few people in his network. Nothing huge, just small connections. But those introductions made me believe the relationship was genuine, that he was actually invested in helping younger people in the industry succeed. And because of that, I became comfortable sharing ideas with him. Not every idea, but the ones I thought had real potential. Around that time, I had been thinking a lot about a particular gap in the market, something that seemed obvious once he noticed it. The industry was evolving quickly, but most companies were still operating under an outdated model. Clients were changing. Expectations were changing. But the services offered by most firms hadn't adapted. I kept coming back to the same thought. What if someone built a company specifically designed around that gap? Not a traditional firm. Something leaner, more focused, a model that aligned directly with how clients were starting to think about the industry. For weeks, I worked through the idea privately, sketching structures in notebooks, thinking through potential challenges, testing the logic in my head. At that point, it wasn't a company yet, just an idea that looked increasingly promising. And naturally, when you have an idea like that, you want feedback. You want to know if someone more experienced sees the same potential you do, which is exactly why I mentioned it the next time Robert and I met for coffee. At the time, it felt like a completely normal conversation, just two people talking about business ideas. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. The conversation where I shared the idea didn't feel important at the time. That's probably the part that still stands out the most when I think about it now. It wasn't a pitch meeting. I didn't walk in with a presentation or a business plan. There was no moment where I said, I have something big to show you. It was just another coffee. Same cafe we had been meeting at for months. Same small table near the window. Same kind of conversation we had every time. Robert asked how work was going. I told him about a few projects I was juggling. We talked about industry trends for a while. What companies were doing well? Which ones were struggling? Normal conversation. At some point, Robert leaned back slightly and asked something he had asked before. So what have you been thinking about lately? It was the kind of open question he liked asking. Not, what are you working on right now? But what have you been thinking about? The difference matters, because ideas usually start as thoughts long before they become plans. So I mentioned the idea. At first, it was casual, just describing something I had been noticing in the market. The industry was shifting. Client expectations were changing. But most companies were still offering services the same way they had for years. There was a gap forming, a space where a different kind of company could exist. One that was structured specifically around how clients were starting to think. Robert didn't interrupt while I explained it. He just listened. That part felt normal. He had always been a good listener. But this time he leaned forward slightly and started asking questions. Detailed ones. What would the structure look like? He asked. How would you price the service? What kind of clients would respond to that model first? They were good questions. Exactly the kind of questions you hope a mentor will ask. Because good questions force you to sharpen the idea. So I started explaining more clearly how the service would be structured, why it would solve a specific problem clients were running into, why the traditional model wasn't adapting quickly enough. The more I talked, the more the concept started organizing itself. That's another benefit of those kinds of conversations. Sometimes explaining an idea out loud helps you understand it better yourself. Robert nodded occasionally while I spoke. Sometimes he paused and thought for a moment before asking another question. How would you scale it? He asked at one point. What prevents larger firms from copying the model? That was a question I had already been thinking about. So I explained the positioning, the operational structure, the speed advantage a smaller company would have. Robert listened quietly. Then he gave a small smile. That's interesting, he said. You might actually be onto something there. Hearing that from him meant something. Robert had seen hundreds of ideas over the years. If he thought something had potential that carried weight, the conversation lasted maybe another 20 minutes after that. Eventually, we drifted into other topics. Industry gossip, a conference he was planning to attend, a few stories about deals he had worked on earlier in his career. By the time we stood up to leave, the idea didn't feel like the center of the meeting anymore. It had just been one part of a longer conversation. That's why I didn't think much about it afterward. I assumed one of two things. Either Robert liked the concept but thought it needed more development, or he didn't think it was viable at all. Either way, I expected he would bring it up again if he thought it was worth discussing. But he never did. Weeks passed, then a couple months. The coffee meetings became less frequent. Robert mentioned he had been traveling more, busy with internal projects. expanding some things inside his company. None of that sounded unusual. People at his level are always managing several things at once. We still exchanged occasional messages, short ones, checking in, but the mentorship rhythm slowly faded. Looking back, I realized something now that I didn't recognize then. Robert never asked about the idea again. Not once. At the time, I interpreted that silence in the simplest way possible. He didn't think it was worth pursuing. That happens all the time. Ideas feel exciting when you're exploring them. Then someone with more experience sees a flaw you missed. Or maybe they recognize the market isn't ready yet. Either way, silence becomes the feedback. So eventually I stopped thinking about it. I focus on the work already on my desk. Client projects, career opportunities. The idea stayed in a notebook somewhere, but it wasn't something I was actively building anymore. 6 months passed like that. Then one morning something unexpected happened. I was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through industry news. Just a normal habit, checking announcements, new company launches, partnerships, that kind of thing. A headline caught my attention. Robert's name was in it. At first I assumed it was just another expansion announcement from his company. But the moment I started reading the press release, I felt something in my chest tighten, because the business model described in that article sounded very familiar, uncomfortably familiar. I kept reading. The structure, the service model, the positioning. Each paragraph made the realization clearer. It wasn't similar to my idea. It was my idea, and suddenly I understood exactly why Robert had asked so many questions that day. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the screen. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I hadn't noticed. I read the article again, then a third time, because when something like that happens, your first instinct is to assume you're misunderstanding it. Maybe the concept is just similar. Maybe the language happens to overlap. Maybe it only feels familiar because you've been thinking about the same space in the market. But the more carefully I read, the more obvious it became. The structure was the same. The service model was the same. Even the way the press release explained the market gap sounded familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. I scrolled back to the top of the article. Robert's name was there. Founder. CEO. The article described the idea as something he had been developing quietly for months. That line actually made me smile a little. Not because it was funny, because it confirmed exactly what had happened. The coffee meeting, the questions, the silence afterward. The idea hadn't been dismissed. It had been absorbed. For a few minutes, I sat there thinking about the conversation we had that day. The way he leaned forward when I explained the structure. The questions he asked about scaling. The long pause before he said, "You might be onto something there." Looking back, the entire conversation made more sense. Not as mentorship, as research. That realization didn't come with anger. Not the kind people imagine. There was disappointment, of course. When someone you respect takes advantage of trust, it forces you to adjust how you see them. But anger would have been a waste of time, because the situation was already clear. Legally, there was nothing I could do. I hadn't protected the idea formally. There was no written agreement, no contract, just a conversation. Mentor and mentee talking about business over coffee, which meant there was no legal battle to fight. And even if there had been, wouldn't have been the best use of energy. The only thing that really mattered now was execution. I went back to the article and read it again more carefully. This time not as someone reacting emotionally, as someone studying a competitor. Robert's version of the business looked polished, professional. The press release mentioned early partnerships, a small team already in place, several pilot clients. It was exactly what you would expect from someone with his resources. But the more closely I read, the more I noticed something interesting. The structure he had chosen was predictable. Robert had taken the concept exactly as I described it, but he had built it the way someone with a large established company naturally builds things. Layered, formal, structured with management oversight and multiple internal steps. That approach works very well in certain environments, but it also creates something else. Speed limitations. Large organizations move carefully. Processes take time. Decisions pass through several layers, which meant something important. Even though Robert had launched first, he wouldn't move fast. I closed the article and leaned back in my chair. At that moment, something became very clear. The idea itself was still wide open. Robert had validated it by launching, but he hadn't locked the market. Not even close. Because ideas are only the beginning. Execution decides everything. I reached over and pulled a notebook off the table. The same notebook where I had originally written down the concept months earlier. I flipped through the pages. Market observations, early structural sketches, notes about potential client needs. The foundation was already there. What had changed was my perspective. The first time I thought about the idea, I had been imagining how it might work. Now I knew it worked, because someone else had already launched it, which meant the risk was gone. What remained was competition, and competition can be studied. I opened my laptop, not to write Robert a message, not to confront him, just to start working. The first thing I did was map out Robert's version of the business. What clients he would likely target first, how he would position the service, where his company structure would slow him down. Once you understand those things, strategy becomes much clearer. Robert had 3 major advantages: resources, brand recognition, and an existing network. But I had one advantage that mattered just as much. I knew exactly how the idea had originally been explained, which meant I could see the weaknesses in the way he implemented it. Over the next few hours, I started redesigning the model, simplifying it, removing the layers that would slow execution, making decisions faster, sharper, more focused on the actual client problem. By the time the sun started setting outside my window, something interesting had happened. The disappointment I felt earlier had disappeared. Not because the situation had changed, because my role in it had changed. I wasn't the person who had lost an idea. I was the person about to compete. And the quiet advantage of competing against someone who once listened carefully to your thinking is that you already know exactly how they're going to play the game. So I closed the article about Robert's launch, opened a blank document, and started building the company nobody knew existed yet. The first few months looked very quiet from the outside. If anyone in the industry had checked my schedule during that period, they would have seen nothing unusual. I was still doing the same work I had been doing before. Same clients, same projects, same routine. There were no announcements, no press releases, no new company page online, because I had learned something important from watching Robert's launch. Visibility isn't the same thing as progress. Robert had launched publicly, press coverage, industry buzz, early partnerships announced right away. That approach makes sense when you already have a reputation. It creates attention, momentum, but attention also comes with expectations. When you launch loudly, people start watching. And when people start watching, every step takes longer. Every decision becomes more cautious. That wasn't the approach I wanted. So I built quietly, at night, early mornings, weekends, every hour I could find between my existing work. The first step wasn't marketing. It was structure. I redesigned the service model from the ground up, not the idea itself. The idea still worked exactly the same way, but the delivery needed to be faster and simpler than Robert's version. That meant removing layers. Most firms in the industry operated with complicated processes, internal approvals, departments, multiple points of contact. Robert's company had followed that exact pattern. My version wouldn't. Clients would deal directly with the people doing the work. Fewer steps, fewer delays, more speed. Once the structure was clear, I built the operational system. Tools, workflows, templates, everything that would allow the service to scale without slowing down. The first version of the company existed entirely inside my laptop. Documents, processes, client onboarding steps, pricing models, all of it built quietly. No one in the industry knew what I was doing, which was exactly how I wanted it. Because when you're building something new, silence can be an advantage. There are no expectations, no commentary, no people offering opinions before the work even exists. Just progress, About 3 months in a building, I reached the point where the system was ready for its first real test. The first client. That moment is always interesting in any new venture, because until someone actually pays for a service, the idea is still theoretical. I reached out to someone I knew who might benefit from the model. Not a cold pitch, just a conversation, explaining the approach, how it differed from traditional firms, why it solved a specific problem that many clients were running into. The conversation lasted about 30 minutes. At the end of it, the client said something simple. That actually makes a lot of sense. A week later, they signed on. The work began immediately. Because the system had already been built, the service moved quickly, faster than most firms in the industry could deliver. The client noticed that immediately. Speed isn't just convenience in business. It creates confidence. When clients see results quickly, they start paying attention. The project went well. Better than I expected, honestly. Not perfect. No first project ever is. But the model worked. And once something works once, it becomes much easier to repeat. The second client arrived a few weeks later. Then another. Each one came through quiet referrals. People talking to each other, sharing experiences. No marketing campaign. No press announcements. Just results moving through the network. Meanwhile, Robert's company continued operating publicly. I still saw occasional press mentions, interviews, industry coverage about his innovative new venture. But I also noticed something else. The pace of growth looked slow, not failing, but slower than it could have been. Exactly what I had predicted when I studied his structure. The company was operating like a large organization, which meant decisions moved carefully. Processes took time. Clients waited longer than they expected. My company was operating differently. Lean, direct, fast. Clients spoke directly to decision makers. Solutions were delivered quickly. And in industries like ours, speed creates something powerful. Word of mouth. The first year passed quietly. From the outside, it looked like Robert owned the space. His company had the headlines, the brand recognition, the early public momentum. But inside the actual market, something different was happening. Clients were starting to compare experiences. And when they did, they noticed the difference. By the end of the second year, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Robert's company had launched first, but mine was starting to outperform it in every measurable way. By the middle of the second year, the shift in the market became noticeable. Not dramatic, not the kind of moment where everyone suddenly realizes something has changed overnight. It was quieter than that. Small signals at first. A comment from a client during a meeting. A message from someone asking how our service model worked. A referral that came from a direction I hadn't expected. Individually, none of those things meant much. But when you hear the same pattern repeated enough times, it becomes clear that something larger is happening. One of the first signals came during a call with a potential client. Halfway through the conversation, he mentioned something casually. We actually spoke with Robert's team first. I nodded. That made sense. Robert's company had launched publicly months before mine ever appeared in the market. They had the press coverage, the brand recognition, the early buzz. Naturally, clients looking for that kind of service would contact them first. So why did you reach out to us? I asked. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. They're good, he said. But the process felt slow. Slow. That word appeared more often as time went on. Not as criticism. More like quiet observation. Robert's company had built the service the way large established firms usually do. Structured teams, departments, multiple approval steps, processes designed to protect quality, all reasonable decisions. But those structures also created something else. Delay. My company had been built very differently. Lean, direct. Clients spoke directly with the people making decisions. Solutions were delivered quickly. No internal layers slowing things down. That difference started becoming obvious in the market. A few weeks after that conversation, I received an email from someone whose name I recognized immediately. He had been mentioned in Robert's original press release. One of the early clients used to demonstrate the concept's success. The email was short. Several people suggested I speak with you. I'm curious how your model works. We scheduled a call. During that conversation, he explained something interesting. We tried working with Robert's team, he said. They're capable people, but everything felt heavy. Heavy. Another polite way of saying slow. After that conversation, he signed with my company. Not dramatically, just a simple agreement and a new project beginning the following week. That moment stood out to me, not because of the individual client, because of what it represented. The market had begun making comparisons. And once comparisons start happening, momentum shifts. Over the next several months, the same pattern repeated itself. New clients appeared through referrals. Sometimes they had never worked with Robert's company. Other times they had. The reasons they gave were usually similar. Your process looks simpler. We heard you move faster. Someone we trust recommended you. No marketing campaign can compete with that kind of referral because it comes from experience. Satisfied clients telling other clients what worked. Word of mouth. And word of mouth spreads quietly but powerfully in industries where reputation matters. Meanwhile, Robert's company continued operating publicly. Occasionally, I would see an article or interview mentioning his venture. Industry coverage still referred to it as innovative. But when I looked closer at the actual growth numbers, the progress seemed slower than expected. Not failing, just steady. The difference between the two companies was becoming visible. Robert had launched first, but execution over time was telling a different story. By the end of the second year, the numbers inside my company told a clear narrative. Revenue was growing consistently. Client retention was extremely strong. Referrals were increasing every quarter. Most importantly, the service model was scaling exactly the way I designed it. Fast, efficient, focused. Around that same time, something else started happening. People in the industry began connecting the dots. Not publicly, just quietly. Someone would mention that I had once worked closely with Robert. Another person would notice that both companies had appeared around the same time. The similarities in the service model became harder to ignore. Stories assemble themselves slowly in industries like that. Nobody makes formal accusations. People simply observe patterns. But I never participated in those conversations. I never explained the history. Never told anyone about the coffee meeting. Never suggested the idea had originally been mine. Because I didn't need to. The results were speaking loudly enough. Eventually, the moment arrived that I had quietly expected from the beginning. One afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender's name was Robert. The subject line was simple. Catching up. I opened the message and read it carefully. Robert wrote that he had been following my company's progress and was impressed with how quickly it had grown. He said the industry was evolving rapidly and suggested it might make sense for us to meet and discuss potential collaboration opportunities. I leaned back in my chair for a moment after reading it. Not surprised, just thoughtful, because 2 years earlier, Robert had been the mentor, the established name, the person everyone respected. Now, he was reaching out to someone he once assumed would never become competition. And for the first time since that coffee meeting long ago, Robert was the one asking for a conversation. Robert's email sat in my inbox for a while before I replied. Not because I was angry, and not because I needed time to think about what I wanted to say. The truth is, the situation was already very clear. 2 years earlier, I had been the one sitting across from him in a coffee shop, explaining an idea and hoping for guidance. Now he was reaching out to me as a competitor. That shift didn't need a dramatic response. It just needed a professional one. So later that afternoon, I wrote back. The message was short. I thanked him for reaching out and said I appreciated the offer to reconnect. Then I explained that I was focused on continuing to build my company independently. No accusations. No references to the past. Just a clear answer. He responded the next day. Friendly tone, congratulating me on the company's growth. He suggested that even if a partnership didn't make sense immediately, maybe we could still meet and talk about ways our companies might collaborate. Collaboration is a flexible word in business. Sometimes it means partnership. Sometimes it means acquisition. Sometimes it just means someone trying to regain influence in a space they once controlled. I responded the same way. Professional, respectful, but clear. I wished him well and explained that I preferred to keep the companies separate. After that exchange, several months passed quietly. My company continued growing. Not explosively, not in a flashy way startups sometimes do. Just steady growth. More clients, more referrals, more projects moving through the systems we had built. One of the advantages of building quietly is that expectations never get ahead of reality. Every improvement comes from actual results, and those results started speaking for themselves. By the end of that year, we had expanded our team. Not dramatically, just carefully. People who understood the model and could help maintain the speed and simplicity that made the service work. At the same time, I started hearing things indirectly about Robert's company. Nothing dramatic, just small signals. A client mentioning that they had moved away from his firm. Someone in the industry commenting that the process there had become complicated. None of it sounded like failure, but it did sound like friction. And friction is dangerous in service businesses, because when clients feel friction, they start exploring alternatives. Some of those clients eventually found their way to us, not through marketing, not through advertising, through conversations. One client would mention our company to another. Someone would say, "You should talk to them." They move quickly, and gradually that network of referrals expanded. During that period, I heard Robert's name less often in conversations about the idea. Not because his company had disappeared, because the market had shifted. People were now talking about two companies, his and mine, two versions of the same concept, two different execution styles. Eventually, Robert reached out again. Another email, this time a little more direct. He suggested we meet to discuss aligning strategies and possibly combining resources. That phrase caught my attention. Aligning strategies. It's the kind of language people use when the competitive landscape has changed, when collaboration suddenly looks more attractive than competition. I read the email carefully, then closed my laptop for a few minutes. Not because I was tempted, because moments like that deserve reflection. 2 years earlier, I had walked into a coffee meeting, excited to share an idea with someone I respected. Now that same person was asking to collaborate with the company that idea had become. But the situation was different now. I didn't need a mentor. I didn't need validation. And I definitely didn't need a partnership built on a foundation that had started with broken trust. So I wrote back. Same tone as before. Professional. Calm. I thanked him for the offer and explained that I believed both companies were better off continuing independently. That message ended the conversation. Robert didn't reply again after that, and we never spoke directly about the past. The coffee meeting, the press release, the similarities between the companies. None of it. In the years that followed, the industry gradually pieced together the story on its own. People noticed the timeline. The concept appearing first in Robert's press release, then my company appearing quietly afterward, then the market performance shifting, clients moving, results becoming visible. But I never told the story publicly. Not once. Because I didn't need to. The market already understood what mattered. Execution. Ideas appear every day in business. Some are original. Some are borrowed. Some evolve over time. But execution decides everything. Looking back now, I don't feel angry about what happened. At the time, it felt like a betrayal. Mentorship relationships are built on trust. And trust matters. But distance changes perspective. If Robert had dismissed the idea that day, maybe I would have moved on to something else entirely. If he hadn't launched it first, maybe I wouldn't have felt the urgency to build it properly. In a strange way, the situation forced me to focus, to stop talking about possibilities and start building something real. And building something real is where all the value is. In the end, Robert launched first. He had the reputation, the resources, the early headlines. But execution happens over time. And over time, the The company I built quietly simply worked better. That was enough. If you enjoy stories about quiet persistence winning over time, make sure you're subscribed. And if you've ever had someone take credit for something you created, you probably understand why sometimes the most powerful response isn't an argument. It's building something better. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.